Welcome everyone to this very special episode of Geointerview with Dr. Pradeep Taneja. Today we are diving into one of the most complex and high-stake relationships in the global politics, that is India and China. From border disputes to economic interdependence, great power rivalry, shifting regional alliances, this relationship has everything that we know about international relations. And to help us unpack it all, we are joined by Dr. Pradeep Taneja. Dr. Taneja is an Associate Dean International India in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne and a Senior Lecturer in Asian Politics. Dr. Taneja is also a Fellow at Australia India Institute and an Associate at the Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies at the University of Melbourne. Now, what makes his perspective unique? Dr. Taneja has spent over 6 years in China, not just as an academic, but also working in trade policy consultancy in Wuhan for iron and steel industry. That means he has seen China from both a scholarly as well as a business lens. And his research covers Sino-India relations, China's rise as a global power, energy security, and the complex intersection of politics and business in China. So, Dr. Taneja, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Nisar. It's nice to join you here.
Thank you. So, I want to start broad, like really broad. What is, in your opinion, at the heart of the great power rivalry between US and China? Like it's purely about power, or is there something deeper like economic models, political system, maybe even the ideology? So what's your take on that?
I think it's very difficult to just point to one factor. Uh, all of the factors that you mentioned in your question are part of the calculus. They're all important. Their importance varies periodically. Some factors become more important in certain times, and others take sort of precedence in other times. So all of those factors that you mentioned are quite legitimately, variables in this bilateral relationship. Uh, Structural factors, as students of international relations, we know that international politics is often shaped by structural factors. So there are clearly structural factors which determine, or at least have some bearing on the bilateral relationship between China and India. But there is, of course, the fundamental dispute between China and India is over the border. The territorial dispute between China and India is the most fundamental. For example, if you look at the United States and China relationship, it's a complicated relationship. It has been through ups and downs, but there is no fundamental sort of bilateral issue between them, in the sense that there is no border dispute.
Okay.
Um, and that's why we've been through times when U.S. and China established a fairly positive relationship beginning in the early 1970s, and then the relationship seemed to be going well, and lately it's been going downhill. So that's without having any major bilateral issue. India and China obviously have a long-standing border dispute. The border, in fact, has never been defined between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of India. And even during the colonial period, really we had frontiers. We did not really have clear borders between the two civilizations. So the border issue clearly is important. And it doesn't mean that the resolution of the border dispute will simply improve the relationship sort of indefinitely. That's not going to happen, even if the two countries were able to find a way to resolve the border dispute, which is, of course, far from likely anytime soon. But there are also structural factors. Structural factors are that India and China, are both post-colonial states. Both are now sovereign states, have been, I mean, since the 1940s. And as sovereign states, they have their own legitimate interests. And these are both national states, because both the states, after the PRC became a communist sort of state under the Chinese Communist Party, and India became independent in 1947, both of these states adopted a nationalistic narrative. And these narratives are important for nation states to gel together, for people, for example, in India, from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, to feel part of the same nation state. You need some sort of story, you need a narrative. And both the states are built China and India have both built their own narratives. And these narratives are not, they have certain overlapping issues. And those historical overlapping issues clearly continue to affect the bilateral relationship. So, for example, in 1950, when the Chinese People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet and occupied Tibet, it changed the relationship between Tibet and China, but also between Tibet and India, because historically, Tibet had been a buffer between China and India. And the fact that the PLA moved into Tibet, occupied Tibet, and integrated Tibet into the People's Republic of China did create challenges for the bilateral relationship. India eventually, by 1954, India signed an agreement with China on Tibet, and effectively India recognized Tibet as part of the People's Republic of China, as an autonomous region of the People's Republic of China. But that did not alleviate all the tensions between these two countries over territory. So there were territorial issues where India regarded, for example, the McMahon Line in the eastern sector to be the border between Tibet and India. China refused to accept the McMahon Line, and that, of course, led to eventually the 1962 war between China and India. So historical factors have also been important. Structural factors are also important because both China and India see themselves as emerging powers. They certainly see themselves as powers within a multipolar world. And India's position certainly is that India favors a multipolar world. China also says that China wants a multipolar world, except China likes to see a unipolar Asia. China would like to be the dominant power in Asia. It doesn't want any other power to challenge China's influence in the region. India, on the other hand, is not comfortable with an Asia dominated by China. So India legitimately feels that it is also a very significant power in the region. And therefore, if the world is going to be a multipolar world, Asia also needs to be multipolar. And countries like China, Japan, India, are very significant powers in the region. And therefore, they also have, legitimate aspirations to play an important role. And also, they have a lot to contribute. Countries like India have a lot to contribute to the region. So there are structural factors. In Chinese, there is a saying that you can't have two tigers on the same mountain. And if Asia is that mountain, China feels that China should only be the only tiger, but India is not comfortable with that. So there is that structural factor where both India and China want to be influential, powers in the region. China, so far, refuses to acknowledge. It says that India is a major power, but at the same time, it doesn't behave in a way where it is willing to make sure that it is willing to accommodate the rise of India. So, for example, China is the only Asian country that has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. India now has a larger population than China, but China is not willing to accept India as a permanent member of the Security Council, and that is a good indication of China's attitude to the place of India in the region and in the world. So there are historical factors, there are structural factors, there is territorial dispute, and there are now economic factors also. There are economic factors because just as China's economy is slowing, India's economy is growing, and India's economy has been growing for nearly 2 decades now, fairly at a fairly fast clip. It may have slowed recently, but the potential of India, the economic potential of India, is still quite significant. So China also doesn't want to see India compete with China in terms of economic power. So, when you mix all of these variables together, you get a very complicated picture.
Okay. So, since you talked about economics, given how much intermingled China is within the global value chain, it kind of complicates the participation of India in that value chain as well. And China has more leverage when it comes to import trade negotiations as a whole, rather than India has. So, In practical terms, how do you think should India approach this? Like, what's the smart way to balance between the economic necessity that India has in participating in the global value chain, as well as the strategic concerns it shares with China in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah. I mean, the strategic concerns that India has with China are not going to disappear. They're not going to disappear anytime soon. Economically, when China started its economic reforms in the late 1970s, and I first went to China 4 years after China began its economic reforms. And really, to be honest, there was very little difference between China and India. Way back in the early 80s, India and China had roughly the same per capita GDP. And there wasn't a big difference between China and India economically. But China certainly adopted a very pragmatic economic policy. It had clearly it had strategic differences with the United States. It had problems, historical baggage with Europe and Japan, but it continued to open up its economy to to these countries. It invited investments from Europe, from Japan, from the United States, all over the world, in fact. And it wasn't very hesitant when it came to accepting foreign investment. It also reduced trade barriers. It became slowly, from having very backward manufacturing to becoming, the factory of the world. China has come a long way. So China has, it doesn't mean, China has become the world's second largest economy. But at the same time, it continues to have those strategic, problems with the United States, with Japan, with India, and a number of other, countries. So China does have its strategic problems, but it adopted a very pragmatic economic policy, at least until Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. China had a much more pragmatic attitude. Deng Xiaoping, for example, the paramount leader of China until his death in 1997, was a very pragmatic leader. He was devoid of ideology in many ways. I mean, he wanted the survival of the Communist Party, but apart from that, his focus was very much on strengthening China's economy because he realized that China will not become a great power if China's economy remains a third world economy. And therefore, China had to develop its economy. So I think India needs to take a leaf out of China's book. India needs to focus on economic development, single-minded focus on economic development. We should not be distracted by by electoral politics. I mean, electoral politics in a democracy is a necessity, but we should not allow electoral politics to distract our attention from what's needed, which is a single-minded focus on economic development, doing whatever it takes to develop your economy. Because if we do not develop really not just a $5 trillion economy, we need to be a 15 trillion, $20 trillion economy. We are, after all, 1.4 billion people, and India should have a much larger economy than we have at the moment. And therefore, the government's focus should be Indian, economy, Indian companies, Indian people focus should be on on developing a very strong economy.
Of
And if you do that, it also gives you other capabilities. In China's case, by developing China's economy, China has been able to make advances in technology, particularly military technology. It's been able to develop all kinds of military hardware capabilities that, unfortunately, in India, we are still lagging. And to do that, we need to single-mindedly focus on economic development. If we have a strong economy, people come to us, you know. And China, we've seen that in China's case. So the focus has to be on the economy. The world will respect India. China will respect India when India has a strong economy. Without a strong economy, you look at what happened to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union became a military superpower. It had the largest number of nuclear weapons, but it could not hold itself together. And you even now, Putin's Russia, for example, Russia's economy is roughly the size of Australia's economy. Australia has 26 million people. Australia has no claims to be a superpower of any kind, but it has a small economy, and President Putin is trying to behave like a superpower. But it's unsustainable. In the long run, it is unsustainable. So for India to be to meet its aspirations to be a great power, India needs to have first and foremost, India needs to have a strong economy. So there has to be a focus on the economy. Once you have a once you have a good economy, a strong economy, I think other things will fall into place. And that is, in my view, that is the most important thing that India needs to do.
Yes. So there's this saying by Deng Xiaoping himself that there is no dignity in poverty, right? And since you have been in China at the in the post reforms period, you might have seen that how easy it is to scale up an industry in China, right? So why is that so, and what India can learn from that? Like what policy actions that the government takes in China that really helps the businesses to scale up like anything. So what can we learn from China in that case?
Nisarg, there is a number of points, a number of things that India can do, particularly if we are focusing on what India can learn from China. And remember, you can always learn from others, even from your adversaries. You can learn how they have been successful in various things. So India can learn from China, Pakistan can learn from India, Pakistan can learn from even Bangladesh, for example, until recently.
Of
So, so when it comes to what India can learn from China, one of the reasons why China has become the factory of the world is because China is very closely integrated with global supply chains. When it comes to manufacturing, from electronics to toys to basically anything, even if you look at it now in terms of military hardware, China is sort of very closely integrated with global supply chains. Yes, in the military hardware, it's being denied certain advanced sort of inputs which are necessary, for it to develop its military industrial complex. But it's if you look at companies that moved to China beginning in the late 1970s all the way in the 80s and 90s and in the 2000s, most of these companies came to China with the lure of the China market, that China was such a big market, and particularly as its economy was growing at 9% per year for more than 30 years, it became a very attractive market for foreign companies. They could not afford to be outside China. They had to enter China. And Chinese government demanded that if you're coming to China, you need to share some technology with us. You need to localize production. You can't just bring components and then simply assemble them in China. So China became integrated with the global supply chain largely because of foreign investment, foreign direct investment. And some of the first and earliest foreign investors in China were really places like Hong Kong and Taiwan. If you go back and look at the political economy of China, you will find that Japan initially was quite hesitant to invest in China. Hong Kong and Taiwan, and of course a number of other Southeast Asian countries, played a very important part in developing China's manufacturing industry. And these territories, whether it's Hong Kong or Taiwan, they were already very well integrated with the global supply chains. Remember, they were the original tigers of Asia. And they were themselves very well integrated. And when China began to open up its economy, it provided opportunities for them to lower their cost of production by moving production to China. So factories, gradually began to move out of Hong Kong to Guangdong province to Fujian province. And as Taiwanese government relaxed its own rules, then Taiwanese businessmen also began to invest. And eventually, for example, Acer, this company which used to make laptops in Taiwan, Acer eventually moved all its laptop production to China. And a number of Taiwanese companies did the same thing. So China benefited from its proximity to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and of course, Southeast Asia. So in some ways, China had some advantage, which India unfortunately doesn't have, because in South Asia, we did not have a territory which had the same kind of supply chain linkages that some of these companies did in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Southeast Asia. But China also benefited from creating a and facilitating an investment environment in the country where they developed world-class infrastructure, where the Chinese state played an important part. because it wasn't enough to simply say that you can come and invest here. The Chinese government, and particularly local governments, provincial governments, they played a very important part in creating, facilitating infrastructure in their own provinces, which made it much easier for foreign companies to operate in those provinces. And initially, if you go back and look at which provinces in China first industrialized, it wasn't, in fact, Shanghai. It was Guangdong and Fujian provinces. And these two provinces had a long history of overseas Chinese. Most of the Chinese living overseas in Southeast Asia originate from either Guangdong province or Fujian province. And they were willing to move to these provinces because they could speak their own dialect. Even if they didn't speak Mandarin, they could speak the local dialect. They could have familiar food because the Cantonese people could get Cantonese food very easily in Guangdong province. Taiwanese coming from Taiwan found that Taiwanese cuisine, Hokkien or Fujian cuisine, was easily available, in southern Chinese provinces. So, in many ways, these advantages that China had by opening up to overseas Chinese, to people from Hong Kong, people from Taiwan. And remember, China has a major problem with Taiwan, but still it allowed Taiwanese companies to invest in China. In fact, even today, there's nearly 1 million people from Taiwan living in and around Shanghai. You know, so China welcomed those people to come and invest, bring their businesses, bring their factories to China. China tremendously benefited from that movement of capital, technology, and talent and people. So China showed pragmatism. And that's what I think India needs to do. India needs to show pragmatism because, yes, we do not have places like Hong Kong and Taiwan next door to us, but still we should be focusing on developing those supply chain linkages and building infrastructure, not only highways. India has done very well in highways, but Indian cities still have, traffic still chokes these cities. From Bangalore to Delhi, traffic is still a huge problem in India. So it's easier to travel between one city and another, but once you hit the city's borders, it is still a problem. So India needs to build, the urban infrastructure in the cities itself. And finally, I would say that India needs to reconsider membership of trading blocs. India is not part of any major trading bloc. So, for example, India negotiated for joining RCEP as a founding member, and at the last minute, India pulled out of RCEP. And India was never part of the TPP negotiations. Now, the US pulled out of TPP, but TPP still went ahead under a slightly different name. But TPP and RCEP, these trading blocs are important, particularly for foreign companies who are thinking of setting up factories in a country like India. They want to be part of they want India, the country where they're investing, to be part of a free trade bloc from where they can easily export their goods. They can import their, inputs, but they can also export their product. And that's why, since many multinational companies adopted a China plus one strategy, they started looking for alternative sites for investment. And Vietnam has done much better than India when it comes to, attracting foreign capital, foreign manufacturing into Vietnam. Uh, India ideally should be much more attractive because India has 1.4 billion people, and therefore it has a much stronger consumer base. But instead, many of these companies chose to go to Vietnam. I'm not saying India is not attractive to anything. For example, India attracted Apple. Apple is manufacturing, iPhones in India, but there should be many more Apples coming to India, many more companies like Apple coming to set up manufacturing in India. But instead, Vietnam has been more successful at attracting these companies than India, largely because Vietnam, of course, is also proven to be quite dynamic. It is also now much more integrated into global supply chains, but primarily because Vietnam is a member of both RCEP and TPP. It is a
Yes.
member of both of these trading blocs. India is not a member of either. So I think this is also important. I know India was reluctant to sign RCEP because of the worry about China, that if we open up the Indian market to Chinese companies, they'll kill us. Chinese manufacturers would kill us. It would be difficult for Indian, nascent manufacturing industries to compete against Chinese companies. But I still think that India needs to rethink its policy on joining these trading blocs, because for foreign companies who and they will play a major part in India's in creating employment, for example. We have a major problem in India. We have a burgeoning youth unemployment problem. We have university graduates who are unable to find jobs. We have still a very large proportion of India's population is still dependent on agriculture. Agriculture contributes less than 14% to India's GDP, but nearly half of India's population is still employed in agriculture or associated industries. No country has ever become Viksit or developed with such a large proportion of its population working in the agricultural sector. You have to reduce dependence on agriculture. I mean, we should aim to increase agricultural share of GDP without, increasing agricultural labor. And to do that, we need to bring about some structural changes in the Indian economy. So I think these are the lessons from China. From my observation, I've been observing Chinese economy now for more than 40 years. And every time I go to China, I look at where China is today. And I'm not envious of China, but I certainly feel that India could take some lessons from China when it comes to focusing on developing its economy.
So, as you said, the role of local ecosystems in development of a nation. So, I read somewhere that China spends 50% of its union budget in local governance, right? And the same statistics for India stands at what, 5 or 6%. Like the union government doesn't spend more than 5 to 6% in the local government, right?
Mm.
So that is something that we should also learn from China. Another thing is incentives within Chinese bureaucracy are aligned in such a way that unless and until you don't have your own developmental agenda in local governance, you won't rise up the ranks in the Communist Party, right?
Mm.
So maybe some part of this we can learn, maybe some might not apply to us, but this is something really interesting. Like even our primary education, China has a world-class primary education ecosystem, which India doesn't have. So these are the factors that we should really work on as a nation to really make the best of our geography as well as our economy. So yeah, there are many lessons to learn from that. India tightened its FDI rules for Chinese investment, but here's a different take. What if we actually allow more Chinese investment in real terms? At least in the strategic sectors like electronics and automobiles, something that are strategic and have a future value creation possibility. Since more these economies will be interconnected, the more leverage everyone has in this setting. So, do you think this is a valid argument, or are there any unintended consequences of doing so?
I mean, when when a sovereign government decides that it is interested in inviting foreign capital into the country, foreign direct investment, I mean, not just portfolio investment in shares in Indian companies, but foreign direct investment, it makes a deliberate decision. It creates the framework within which foreign companies can enter the country. And India has been doing this ever since 1991, when India first began to open up its economy. India has created a framework, um, but still, it is quite bureaucratic in many ways. And as far as Chinese companies are concerned, there are a number of areas in which Chinese companies have done very well globally, right? And and it would make sense to look at where China's strengths are, where Chinese companies can actually add value to our own industry, where they can be, a transfer of knowledge, transfer of technology in some areas, And remember, the Chinese and Japanese have done the same thing in the past. First the Japanese, then the Chinese. They allowed foreign companies, and particularly in the case of China, they allowed foreign companies, they brought foreign technology, and they adopted their technology then and actually made it even better, you know? And that's why I think in areas where China has done very well, whether it is production of photovoltaic, panels, the solar panels, where we are still importing, a lot of solar panels from China. China has become one of the most cost-effective producer of solar panels. I think instead of importing solar panels from China, we should be encouraging Chinese companies to actually come
Right.
and form joint ventures with Indian companies and produce them in India. Similarly, with electric vehicles, China certainly is now one of the world's leaders, if not the leader, when it comes to electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are the future. We need to find ways, create a policy framework where we can invite Chinese companies to come and produce those electric vehicles in India and work with Indian companies, preferably in a joint venture. But even if they're not willing to come in a joint venture, we need to set some rules about, what sort of technology they'll bring, state of the art technology, not the old technology of 5 years ago or 10 years ago. We demand that we want, the advanced technology. And if those cars are being produced in India, eventually that technology does spill over, for the broader Indian industry. So I think we need not be too afraid of inviting Chinese capital into India. Certainly, we need to be careful in terms of which sectors we allow Chinese companies in. There's no need for Chinese companies to be coming into textiles or garments or you know small machine tools, but we should be inviting Chinese companies in areas where they certainly have an advantage. China did the same thing. Remember, China opened up its economy to investment by American companies, German car companies. In fact, I still remember Volkswagen. Volkswagen was the first European car company to be allowed to form a joint venture with the Shanghai-based automotive, state-owned automotive company, and they started producing, this Shanghai brand Volkswagen cars in China, and they became almost visible everywhere in China. I mean, you could see those Shanghai cars everywhere. Later on, they allowed Audi, they allowed almost every brand from Toyota to Japanese cars to German cars. They allowed everybody to enter the Chinese market. And now, of course, China has become one of the largest exporters of cars in the world. So they were not intimidated by the difficulties of managing foreign capital and foreign technology, and nor should we, nor should India be intimidated by foreign companies. We should have our own rules and regulations, but at the same time, we should not be so protective or so afraid that we do not allow these companies to invest in China. Sorry, to invest in India.
Yes, of course. So again, coming back to geopolitics now, and this is also connected with the trade and economic part of it. There is a narrative in India that India needs a grand strategy to deal with China, but I find, like, how does it look? How will that grand strategy look like? Because if we talk about grand strategy, it should not only focus on China, right? It has to be, it needs to have a broader horizon that goes beyond that. So how does India create something like that that lasts beyond election cycles and something that genuinely informs the policymaker? Now, don't get me wrong, Indian policymakers are kind of very much proactive when it comes to China, at least in the diplomatic alignments. But even the commerce ministry, they know, they do understand this, and this has been very much clearly communicated in the economic survey as well, that India should allow Chinese investment. But the problem is, how do you sell it to electorates, since
Mm.
we have a sovereignty issue with China when it comes to northeast borders? So this is where I think government takes a step back when it comes to allowing Chinese investment in India. But the industry within India is kind of lobbying that let's allow it, and that's why we are saying it out loud in our economic survey as well. So should India focus on creating a grand strategy?
I mean, if you look at the history of grand strategies, usually grand strategies are the preserve of major powers. major powers that actually can shape the international system. And they generally are much more successful at forming a grand strategy and actually seeing it through. Middle powers often are responding to signals in the international system. As the international system is shaped by um interactions among major powers and their allies, it changes conditions under which middle powers have to operate. I personally don't think it should be India's number one priority, having a grand strategy, but India does need to have a more consistent policy on China. It needs to have a consistent policy of China because currently Indian policy and India's relations with China are constantly going up and down, up and down. And a minor issue can blow up into a bigger issue and it can affect the bilateral relationship. So I think there needs to be some consistent policy on how we are going to manage some of the fundamental differences that we have with China. For example, acknowledging that the border dispute, while we continue to negotiate, continue to talk to China about the border issue, but at the same time, we also need to be aware that this is not an issue which is going to be resolved anytime soon. And therefore, while we continue to engage in dialogue with China on the border dispute, and if China, of course, comes up with a proposal which is acceptable to India, then of course we should grab it and resolve this dispute. But in my opinion, it's unlikely to happen anytime soon because there is now a growing asymmetry between China and India in terms of hard power. And China doesn't see any real incentive for it to resolve the border dispute now. I mean, 40 years ago would have been a better time for this dispute to be resolved. Now China doesn't see any real incentive, real reason to resolve this dispute. So we need to be clear-eyed about it, that this is a dispute which needs to be managed. It is not going to be resolved anytime soon. But if that is if that is an understanding that we have that this is a long-term issue, then we need to develop a consistent set of policies on investment, policies on economic relations with China, policies on working with China where we can in the multilateral fora, for example, whether it's on climate change. And climate change is an important issue for both China and India. President Trump may not be interested in doing anything about climate change, but the fact is that people in countries like China and India suffer from the effects of climate change. For India and China, this is a priority. So areas where we can work bilaterally together, and for example, on economic cooperation, and also in multilateral fora, where we can work with China to not only improve the global environment for India, you know, global strategic environment, but also to improve a regional environment for India, because there's no point constantly chasing China's sort of initiative or responding or reacting to what China is doing in India's neighborhood. Uh, China has thrown nearly 55 billion US dollars at Pakistan, mostly in the form of loans. And it's helped build some infrastructure in China, but it has in Pakistan, but it hasn't solved Pakistan's problem. Pakistan remains a basket case. And so for India, it has to be very careful how it spends its money in the neighborhood. And we need to have a consistent policy, on how we respond to China's actions in our neighborhood. If China wants to throw its money, waste its money, good luck to China. You know, we don't have to follow, China's example. We should be much more judicious in how we use our own resources. That doesn't mean that we should not aim to have friendly relations with our neighborhood, because if you don't have a a friendly neighborhood, a neighborhood with which you have a positive relationship, where the neighborhood feels that they actually benefit from having good relations with India, that there are real benefits. For example, giving access to the Indian market, to neighboring countries, even on a unilateral basis initially. without seeking reciprocity, it would then develop stakes for these countries in India's economy. Their economies will become much more integrated with the Indian economy. Um, Sri Lanka, for example, China, Sri Lanka signed up to China's Belt and Road Initiative. We should be, working with Sri Lanka to, for example, developing land connectivity. I know both the governments have talked about land connectivity, but a sea bridge connecting Sri Lanka and India would also help in integrating the economies of Sri Lanka and India. For Sri Lanka, a small country with a small population, roughly the size of Australia, having access to the Indian market would be very beneficial. It will lock Sri Lankan economy into the Indian economy. It'll make them interdependent. And those are the ways you can actually increase interdependence and improve relationship. Simply giving line of credit now and some other grant, next year, that's not enough. We need to do more to make sure that these countries feel that they have a stake in India's rise, both economically and strategically. So that is, I think, that's a project which needs to be continued, where India needs to do better. If we have a if we have a more peaceful, friendlier neighborhood, then it will make it easier for India to pursue its regional and global, aspirations.
Yes, of course. So I read your paper on how these small island nations within the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in the South Asia, they have some sort of agency in the grand scheme of things. So can you unpack that paper a bit for us?
Okay. I think you're referring to my article
Yes,
in the Journal of Indian Ocean
yes,
Region. I'm
yes,
in
yes.
fact about to finish a book on this issue. And so we've looked at the instead of simply taking small states in the region, particularly the small island states in the region as powerless, uh, you know, adopters of other people's agendas, we would be making a mistake. Because even smaller states, because under the international system, these are sovereign states. And as sovereign states, they have some agency. And they often exercise that agency. They exercise that agency to advance their own interests. They tend to be very, very pragmatic when it comes to taking whatever they can take from one power and then the other power, and they play one against the other. So they do exercise agency. But not all small states or small island states are able to exercise that agency successfully. Some are more successful than others. So what I'm doing now in the new book with my colleague Derek McDougall, we are looking at the variables. We're trying to develop those variables further, variables that affect the agency of smaller states. Why some small states are more successful at exercising agency than others. So there's clearly a number of variables which are important for small states. But the important thing is for states like China and India, it's important to understand that small states are, they're quite clever, and they can exercise their own agency. As sovereign states, they take advantage of their status. And in the case of island states, because many of the island states also have very large exclusive economic zones, you know and they use that as a lure for other countries, even extra regional countries, to come and help them develop, and therefore financially gain from attracting these countries into their own exclusive economic zones. So there is a number of variables, and currently, as I said, this is not probably the time to go into the detail.
We will also attach the your paper in our show notes as well.
Okay, yeah, good. Yeah.
Right. So US is obviously a major player in the Indo-Pacific, and its relationship with India directly affects China's security calculations, right? But what exactly is America's game plan here? Like, what does Washington actually want in the region, especially Mr. Trump, now that he's in the White House? What do you think is he up to when it comes to Indo-Pacific, and how will he manage the complicated India-China-US triangle?
Mm. It is It is true that United States is a major factor. It's a major player in the Indo-Pacific. It has been since the end of the Second World War. United States has been a major force. In fact, the most powerful force in the Indo-Pacific region, in East Asia. But the new term that we use now, the Indo-Pacific, it is a major player. And United States, of course, will always pursue its own interests. United States is not going to do anything which harms its interest but benefits somebody else. So, as far as India is concerned, and this triangular relationship is concerned between U.S., China, and India, uh, clearly over the last, I would say, 20 years, since 2005, Manmohan Singh's, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's visit to the U.S. Since then, we have seen U.S. lean more towards India. In 2005, President George Bush Jr., he said that the United States would help India become a great power. And the nuclear agreement, the civil nuclear cooperation agreement between the US and India was part of that strategy. So although we have seen presidents in the White House of different political persuasions, both Democrats and Republicans, US policy on India has been consistent. US has continued to improve relations with India. In fact, the relationship between India and the US allies in the region, I must add. For example, Japan and Australia, two key allies of the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, both of them have a better relationship with India now than they've ever had. Right? So it's not just the US. The key US allies in the Indo-Pacific also have a much stronger relationship with India. And that is largely because there is a convergence of interests. There is, although the official rhetoric talks about we are democracies, a democracy is all fine. But the fact is that there is a convergence of strategic interests.
Of,
All of the United States and its major allies in the region now find that China is the biggest challenge for all of them. And for India also, I often say that Pakistan is more of a nuisance. China is the real challenge for India. And India finds that China is its biggest challenge. US now is focusing on the Indo-Pacific. As we have seen recently with J.D. Vance's speech in the Munich Security Conference, he's antagonized the Europeans. So the Atlantic Alliance is now being debated whether it will last. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, US's primary interests are in the Indo-Pacific. And US recognizes that the primary threat to the United States hegemony or primacy, whatever you want to call it, is China. And US alone can't deal with it. US needs like-minded countries. Obviously, it's got Japan and Australia and a number of other smaller, countries in the region that are treaty allies of the United States. India is not a treaty ally, and the US understands that India will never be a treaty ally of the United States. But at the same time, there is a convergence of interests. So this convergence of interest means that US-India relationship is, for now, going to only get stronger
right,
because, and it has nothing to do, in my view, although personal chemistry between leaders can make a difference in international relations, we all know that. But regardless of who leads India and who leads the United States, I think there is structural reasons why US-India relationship will continue to grow because US, India, Japan, Australia, and the other powers in the region, they regard China as the biggest threat to their interests. They may not have territorial disputes with China. India and Japan, of course, do, but Australia and the US do not have any territorial dispute with China, at least not their own. But they do have an interest in constraining China's influence in the region. So that's why US, for example, now advocates, talks about a multipolar world. And of course, all the other countries in the region talk about a multipolar world. And India's interest is in making sure that these powers support the creation of a multipolar world in which India is an important player. So I think that strategic convergence among these countries is the main reason. It's not, ideology. It is not even democracy, in my view. It's not even personal chemistry between leaders. I think it is the structural convergence of interest that is the driving force of this relationship.
Yes, that's very true. So, finally, something for the audience watching. If someone wants to build a career in international relations and strategic studies, what's the best advice you would give them? Like something you wish you knew when you were starting at it.
I mean, compared to when I was a young university student in India, we didn't have any resources. There was no internet. We couldn't even get, magazines from and newspapers from other countries on time. Indian newspapers used to have one page of world news. Most of the Indian English newspapers used to have one page, sometimes only half a page of world news. So you can see how constrained we were in terms of access to information. Now, everybody, whether you are in India, whether you are in New Delhi, Calcutta, or Washington, you have the same access to information. You're getting the same information. So, my advice to young members of Geostrata, for example, and other listeners would be that don't become inundated by information. Information itself is not knowledge. You have to learn, you have to develop your own systems of knowledge where you develop, because everybody learns differently. And my advice would be that if you have an interest in world affairs and in strategic affairs, then make sure that you learn systematically. Don't spend all your time simply chasing news because that's a thankless job, trying to chase news. Information is available. What you need to focus on is your ideas. You need to develop your own ideas. Information can be useful in doing that, but there is no shortcut to reading classical works in international relations, for example. You have to understand how the world works, and that's why international relations theory is very important. Different schools of thought. There is no consensus on which is the most effective IR theory, but there are different theoretical schools. So if you build a strong foundation in international relations theory, how different scholars perceive how the world operates, you would be in a much better position to develop your own ideas. Because ultimately, you have to develop your own ideas. Information would be helpful only if you know how to use that information, how to frame that information. And for that, there is no shortcut to reading books. So instead of wasting all your time following news, I think you should read the important works in international relations. Develop your strong foundation when it comes to international relations theory and how the world works in general. And then you'll be in a much better position to use that information.
Some of
Can,
the IR scholars that you think that everyone should read on.
some of the IR scholars, I would say that I wouldn't name because I don't want to name any particular scholars, but I would say that when it comes to international relations theory, have a balanced sort of read between American IR theory. American IR theory has been quite dominant, particularly when it comes to realism. Realist scholars, have generally been much more dominant in American academia. So certainly, by all means, read American scholarship, but you should not ignore scholarship from Europe. Europe, remember, much of the international relations theory is based on the Western experience, Western history. So read the European scholars also, and different European scholars. There's the English school, there is the constructivist, even critical international relations theory. Because I think a good international relations student should be well versed in different schools of thought, and then develop your own way of thinking. But also Indian scholars. India has a long history, particularly since independence. If you're looking at the international relations and to make sense of international relations, you have to look at Indian scholarship. For example, if we want to understand the Indian Ocean, the geopolitics in the Indian Ocean, how can we go past Panikar's writings on the Indian Ocean? Or if we want to understand, the bilateral relationship with China, how can we go, you know, beyond or without reading some of the scholars who were writing in the 1950s and 60s on that relationship. So you need to diversify your reading. You need to, build a strong base. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, but give yourself that time. Don't just be obsessed by information. If you want to convert that information into knowledge, you need to have a strong foundation in some of the basic concepts.
Right. So with this, we are at the end of this Geo interview. Thank you, Dr. Pradeep Taneja, for accepting our invitation and providing us with a vast ocean of this knowledge about India and China and way beyond that. And we look forward to hosting you again.
Thank you, Nisarg, and thank you, your colleagues at Geostrata. I mean, there's several people who have been in touch with me over the last few weeks, and I want to thank all of them. And keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.